Sarah Martinez had always been different, and everyone at Lincoln High School made sure she knew it. At 17, she was the girl who wore the same 3 faded sweaters in rotation, whose sneakers had holes that she covered with duct tape, and whose lunch often consisted of whatever she could scrape together from the free meal program. Her thick-rimmed glasses, held together with medical tape, sat crooked on her nose, and her dark hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail that had seen better days. The teasing started early in her freshman year and had only gotten worse with time. Madison Pierce, the golden-haired daughter of the town's most successful real estate developer, led the daily torment with the precision of a military operation. Every morning, as Sarah walked through the hallways of Lincoln High, she could hear the whispers following her like a shadow. "Look, it's Salvation Army, Sarah," Madison would say loud enough for everyone to hear, her perfectly manicured fingers pointing at Sarah's worn clothing. "Did you get that outfit from the bargain bin again?" Sarah would keep her head down, clutching her second-hand backpack tighter, trying to make herself invisible. But invisibility was impossible when you were the target of the school's most popular girl and her army of followers. The hallways seemed to stretch endlessly as she made her way to her locker, each step accompanied by snickers and cruel comments. "My dad says her family lives in that tiny apartment behind the laundromat," Jessica Chen would add, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "How embarrassing. I couldn't imagine living like that." The truth was that Sarah's family did live in a small 2-bedroom apartment behind Martinez Cleaners, the struggling dry cleaning business her parents had owned for the past 8 years. Her father, Miguel, worked 16-hour days trying to keep the business afloat, while her mother, Carmen, took on evening shifts at the local diner to make ends meet. They were good people, hard-working people, but in a town where success was measured by the size of your house and the brand of your car, being poor was seen as a personal failing. Sarah had learned to find refuge in the school library during lunch breaks. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly librarian, never asked questions when Sarah would slip in with her brown bag lunch and find a quiet corner among the history books. It was there, surrounded by stories of people who had overcome impossible odds, that Sarah found her escape and her inspiration. She was particularly drawn to biographies of military heroes and pioneers who had broken barriers. The story of Amelia Earhart fascinated her, as did the tales of the Tuskegee Airmen and the first female pilots to fly combat missions. In these pages, Sarah found people who had been underestimated, dismissed, and told they didn't belong, yet they had soared above their circumstances in the most literal sense. It was during one of these lunch periods that Sarah first learned about the military's outreach programs. A small flyer tucked between the pages of a book about military aviation caught her attention. The pamphlet described opportunities for young people to explore military careers, including programs that help students from disadvantaged backgrounds access education and training opportunities. That evening, as her parents worked late into the night pressing clothes and balancing the books, Sarah sat at the small kitchen table with her laptop, a second-hand device her parents had sacrificed to buy for her education. She began researching military academies, ROTC programs, and scholarship opportunities. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of hope that there might be a path out of the cycle of poverty and ridicule that seemed to define her life. The next few months passed in a blur of applications, essays, and preparation. Sarah threw herself into her studies with renewed vigor, her grades climbing from good to excellent. She began waking up at 5 in the morning to run through the quiet streets of her neighborhood, training her body as she sharpened her mind. Her parents, initially concerned about their daughter's sudden military interests, began to see the positive changes in her confidence and determination. But the teasing at school only intensified as Sarah's transformation became more apparent. Madison and her friends seemed to sense that their target was slipping away from them, and they escalated their cruelty in response. "Now she thinks she's going to be a soldier," Madison announced loudly during chemistry class, causing the entire room to erupt in laughter. "Can you imagine? Little Miss Nobody trying to play Army. She probably thinks they'll take anyone," added Brett Morrison, the quarterback whose own academic performance was barely keeping him eligible for the football team. "Wait until they see where she comes from. Military schools don't want charity cases." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she forced herself to keep working on her lab assignment. She had learned that responding to their taunts only made things worse, and she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break down. During her senior year, Sarah received news that would change everything. Her application to the United States Military Academy at West Point had been accepted, contingent upon completing a preparatory program and maintaining her academic standards. The letter arrived on a particularly difficult day, when Madison had orchestrated a particularly cruel prank involving fake love letters supposedly from various boys in school. Sarah had found the letters taped to her locker, each one more humiliating than the last, designed to make her believe that someone might actually be interested in her romantically, only to discover they were all fake when she tried to approach the supposed authors. The entire school had been in on the joke, and Sarah had spent her lunch period in the bathroom, tears streaming down her face as she heard the laughter echoing from the hallways. But when she arrived home that afternoon and saw the official envelope with the West Point seal, everything changed. Her hands trembled as she read the acceptance letter, and, for the first time in months, she allowed herself to smile. Her parents, who had been watching her struggle with the daily humiliation at school, embraced her with tears of joy and pride. The news of Sarah's acceptance spread through the school like wildfire, but, instead of congratulations, it was met with skepticism and renewed mockery from her tormentors. She probably lied on her application, Madison declared during lunch, her voice carrying across the cafeteria. There's no way someone like her got into West Point. My dad knows people there, and he says they only accept the best families. Maybe it's some kind of diversity program, Brett added with a smirk. You know, they have to fill quotas for poor kids. The whispers and doubts began to eat away at Sarah's confidence. Despite having the acceptance letter in her possession, she began to question whether she truly belonged at such a prestigious institution. The voices of her classmates seemed to echo the fears that plagued her in her quieter moments. As graduation approached, Sarah found herself walking through the school hallways for what would be the last time as a student. The same corridors that had witnessed 4 years of humiliation and pain would soon be just a memory. Yet even as she prepared to leave for West Point's preparatory program, the doubts instilled by years of psychological warfare continued to haunt her. The final weeks of school were marked by a sense of surreal anticipation. Sarah continued her rigorous physical training routine, running through the pre-dawn darkness of her neighborhood, preparing for the challenges that awaited her at West Point. She spent hours studying military history and leadership principles, determined to prove that she deserved her place among the future officers of the United States Army. Her parents watched with a mixture of pride and concern as their daughter prepared to enter a world they barely understood. Miguel would often find Sarah at the kitchen table late at night, surrounded by books on military strategy and leadership, her notebook filled with quotes from famous military leaders and her own reflections on what it meant to serve something greater than oneself. Mija, he would say gently, placing a weathered hand on her shoulder, remember that no matter what anyone says, you earned this opportunity. Your mother and we are so proud of the young woman you have become. Carmen would pack extra food in Sarah's lunch, knowing that her daughter often skipped meals to avoid the cafeteria and its daily dose of humiliation. She watched her daughter's transformation with amazement, seeing the scared freshman evolve into a determined young woman with a clear sense of purpose. The irony was not lost on Sarah that while her classmates planned for college parties and spring break trips funded by their parents' wealth, she was preparing for a life of service and sacrifice. The contrast between their priorities and hers had never been more stark, yet she found herself grateful for the different path her circumstances had forced her to take. As the school year drew to a close, Sarah received another piece of news that would prove to be the catalyst for an extraordinary turn of events. A representative from West Point would be visiting the school to meet with her and discuss the preparatory program. The visit was scheduled for the last week of school, and Sarah was instructed to be available during her lunch period for the meeting. What she didn't know was that this routine visit would become anything but routine, and that her tormentors were about to witness something that would forever change how they viewed the girl they had spent 4 years trying to break down. The morning of the West Point representative's visit dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of spring sunshine that made everything seem possible. Sarah had barely slept the night before, alternating between excitement about meeting with the academy representative and anxiety about what her classmates might do to sabotage this important moment. She had chosen her best outfit, a simple navy blue dress that her mother had bought for her job interviews, and had spent extra time making sure her appearance was as professional as possible. Principal Johnson had announced during morning assembly that a military representative would be visiting the school, though he hadn't mentioned Sarah by name. The news rippled through the student body like electricity, and, by second period, everyone knew that the visit was specifically for Sarah Martinez. The reactions ranged from grudging curiosity to outright disbelief, with Madison Pierce leading the charge of skeptics. "I bet when he sees her, he'll realize there's been some kind of mistake," Madison whispered loudly enough for half the class to hear during English literature. "Military schools have standards, you know. They can't just let anyone in." Mrs. Peterson, their English teacher, shot Madison a disapproving look but said nothing. Like many of the faculty members at Lincoln High, she had witnessed the systematic bullying of Sarah Martinez over the years but had felt powerless to stop it. The social dynamics of small-town high schools were complex, and Madison's father was not only wealthy but also served on the school board. Sarah tried to focus on her morning classes, but the anticipation was making it impossible to concentrate. During third-period chemistry, she found herself staring out the window at the school's parking lot, wondering what kind of car a West Point representative might drive. Would it be an official military vehicle, or just a regular civilian car? What she didn't expect to see was the convoy of black SUVs that pulled into the parking lot just before lunch. 3 identical vehicles with tinted windows arranged themselves in a precise formation near the main entrance, their occupants invisible behind the dark glass. A small crowd of students had gathered at the classroom windows, murmuring about the unusual arrival. "Those look like Secret Service cars," whispered Jake Patterson, a student known for his obsession with conspiracy theories and government operations. "I wonder what's really going on." Sarah felt a knot forming in her stomach. This seemed like far more than a simple meeting with an academy representative. Perhaps there had been some kind of mistake, or maybe she was in trouble for something she didn't understand. The scenarios running through her mind grew more anxious with each passing minute. When the lunch bell rang, Sarah made her way to the principal's office as instructed, her heart pounding with each step. The hallway seemed unusually quiet, with most students having rushed to the cafeteria or outside to enjoy the beautiful weather. As she approached the administrative wing, she could see that several faculty members were clustered around the main office, speaking in hushed tones and glancing repeatedly toward the parking lot. Mrs. Andrews, the school secretary, greeted Sarah with an unusually warm smile and directed her to wait in the small conference room adjacent to the principal's office. "Someone will be with you in just a moment, dear," she said, her voice carrying an odd note of excitement that Sarah couldn't quite interpret. Sarah had been waiting for only a few minutes when Principal Johnson entered the room, followed by a woman in a crisp military uniform. The woman was tall and imposing, with short-cropped blonde hair and the kind of bearing that immediately commanded respect. Her uniform bore the insignia of a colonel, and her chest was decorated with an impressive array of ribbons and medals. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet Colonel Rebecca Harrison from West Point," Principal Johnson said, his voice carrying a level of formality that Sarah had never heard from him before. "Colonel Harrison has come quite a distance to meet with you personally." Colonel Harrison stepped forward and extended her hand to Sarah, her grip firm and confident. "It's an honor to meet you, Sarah. I've read your application materials and academic records, and I'm very impressed with what you've accomplished under challenging circumstances." Sarah managed to stammer out a thank you, still trying to process why such a high-ranking officer would take the time to visit her personally. In all her research about West Point, she had never read about colonels making personal visits to prospective students. "I understand you might be wondering why I'm here personally," Colonel Harrison said, as if reading Sarah's thoughts. "The truth is, your application stood out not just for your academic achievements, but for your demonstrated resilience and character. We have reason to believe that you represent exactly the kind of leader the military needs." What Colonel Harrison didn't tell Sarah in that moment was that her story had captured the attention of people far beyond the admissions office at West Point. Sarah's essay about overcoming adversity and her commitment to serving others despite her own struggles had been shared among senior military leadership as an example of the kind of character they sought in future officers. Unknown to Sarah, her guidance counselor, Mrs. Rodriguez, had been so moved by Sarah's transformation and determination that she had reached out to a family friend who worked in military recruitment. That friend had connections that reached deep into the Department of Defense, and Sarah's story had eventually made its way to the desk of a general who had grown up in similar circumstances. "Sarah," Colonel Harrison continued, "I'd like to invite you to step outside with me." There's something I want to show you, and some people I'd like you to meet. As they walked toward the main entrance, Sarah could see that a crowd had gathered in the cafeteria windows overlooking the parking lot. Students and faculty members alike were pressed against the glass, trying to get a better view of the mysterious vehicles and their occupants. Madison Pierce was among them, her face pressed against the window with an expression of confused curiosity. When they stepped outside, Sarah was amazed to see that the three SUVs had been joined by additional vehicles. Military personnel in various uniforms were stationed around the parking lot, their presence lending an air of official importance to the entire scene. But it was the sound that caught Sarah's attention first, a distant thumping that seemed to be growing closer with each passing second. "Sarah," Colonel Harrison said, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder, "what you're about to see is not standard protocol for academy visits. But your story has inspired a lot of people, and they wanted to make sure you understood just how much your determination means to those of us who serve." The thumping sound grew louder, and Sarah looked up to see a Black Hawk helicopter approaching from the east. The aircraft was magnificent, its rotors cutting through the air with mechanical precision as it approached the school grounds. Students were now streaming out of the building, drawn by the unmistakable sound of military aviation. But Sarah barely noticed the growing crowd. Her eyes were fixed on the helicopter as it began its descent toward the school's football field. This was the kind of aircraft she had only seen in movies and documentaries, the same type of helicopter that had carried soldiers into battle and rescued people from impossible situations. As the Black Hawk touched down on the 50-yard line, Sarah could see the faces of her classmates pressed against windows and gathered along the fence that separated the parking lot from the athletic fields. Madison Pierce was among them, her mouth hanging open in disbelief as she realized that this extraordinary display was somehow connected to the girl she had tormented for 4 years. Colonel Harrison had to speak loudly to be heard over the noise of the helicopter's engines. "Sarah, there are some people aboard that aircraft who have been following your journey and wanted to meet you personally. They represent everything you've been working toward, and they're here because they believe in your potential." As the helicopter's engines wound down, Sarah watched in amazement as the aircraft's doors opened. The first person to step out was another colonel, this one a man with graying hair and a chest full of combat ribbons. He was followed by a sergeant major whose bearing spoke of decades of military experience, and, finally, by a woman in civilian clothes who carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. The small group approached Sarah and Colonel Harrison, their movements crisp and purposeful despite having just stepped off a military helicopter. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the surreal nature of the situation. Just that morning, she had been worried about surviving another day of high school ridicule, and now she was standing face to face with senior military officers who had apparently flown to her school specifically to meet her. The second colonel extended his hand to Sarah with a warm smile. "Ms. Martinez, I'm Colonel James Mitchell from the Department of Defense. I wanted to meet you personally because your story represents something we don't see often enough in today's world. You've demonstrated the kind of character and determination that makes outstanding military leaders." The sergeant major stepped forward next, his handshake firm and his eyes kind despite his intimidating appearance. "Sergeant Major Williams," he introduced himself. "I grew up not far from here, in circumstances very similar to yours. I want you to know that where you come from doesn't determine where you can go, especially in the military. We judge people by their character and their commitment to excellence." The woman in civilian clothes was introduced as Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a psychologist who worked with the military to identify and develop exceptional leadership potential in young people. "Sarah, your essay about leadership through adversity has been shared throughout the military education community. You've articulated something that many of our most successful officers have experienced but few have been able to express so clearly." As this extraordinary meeting took place on the football field, the entire school had essentially stopped functioning. Teachers had abandoned their lesson plans, and students had gathered at every available window and doorway to witness the unprecedented scene. The local news station had somehow gotten word of the military presence at the school and had dispatched a camera crew, adding to the circus-like atmosphere. Madison Pierce stood with her usual circle of friends, but, for once, she was speechless. The girl she had dismissed as worthless, the target of 4 years of relentless mockery, was being treated with a level of respect and honor that Madison had never witnessed. The cognitive dissonance was almost too much to process. This has to be some kind of mistake, she finally managed to whisper to Jessica Chen. There's no way all of this is for her. But Jessica was staring at the scene with a mixture of awe and dawning realization. Madison, I don't think this is a mistake. Look at how they're treating her. These are important people, and they came here specifically for Sarah. Back on the football field, Colonel Mitchell was explaining to Sarah why they had chosen to make such a dramatic visit. We wanted to make sure that you and everyone else here understood that the military recognizes and honors excellence wherever it comes from. Your achievements are remarkable not in spite of your circumstances, but because of how you've responded to them. Sarah found her voice enough to ask the question that had been burning in her mind since the helicopter landed. Sir, is all of this really for me? I'm just a student from a poor family. I haven't done anything special. Sergeant Major Williams chuckled, a sound that somehow managed to be both gruff and warm. Ms. Martinez, what you call just being a student looks very different from our perspective. You've maintained excellent grades while working part-time to help support your family. You've developed leadership skills despite being given no opportunities to lead. You've maintained your dignity and character despite facing daily challenges that would break many people. That's not nothing special. That's exactly what we're looking for in our future officers. Dr. Walsh added, Sarah, one of the things that impressed us most about your application was your essay about how adversity had taught you to understand and help others who are struggling. That kind of empathy, combined with your demonstrated resilience, represents the future of military leadership. As the meeting continued, Sarah began to realize that this moment was about more than just her acceptance to West Point. These senior military officers had taken time out of their schedules and resources from their budgets to send a message, not just to her, but to everyone watching. They were demonstrating that the military valued character over privilege, determination over social status, and potential over pedigree. The conversation on the football field continued for nearly an hour, with the military officers sharing stories of their own journeys and offering Sarah guidance for the challenges ahead. As they spoke, Sarah began to feel a transformation taking place within herself. For the first time in her high school career, she was being treated not as a victim or an object of pity, but as a person of worth and potential. Colonel Harrison eventually suggested that they move their discussion inside, away from the growing crowd of onlookers and news cameras. As they walked back toward the school building, Sarah was acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes following their every move. Students who had never spoken to her before were now staring with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright amazement. But it was the look on Madison Pierce's face that Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. Gone was the smug superiority that had characterized every interaction they had ever had. Instead, Madison looked confused, almost lost, as if the fundamental assumptions that had governed her worldview were crumbling before her eyes. The group made their way to the school library, where Mrs. Henderson had quickly cleared a space for their continued discussion. As they settled around one of the large tables, Sergeant Major Williams pulled out a folder containing information about Sarah's upcoming preparatory program at West Point. Sarah, I want you to understand that your acceptance to West Point is just the beginning, he explained. The preparatory program you'll be attending is designed to ensure that students from all backgrounds have the tools they need to succeed at the academy. You won't be alone in this journey. Dr. Walsh added, we've arranged for you to be mentored by a graduate who came from circumstances very similar to yours. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos grew up in poverty in East Los Angeles and is now one of the Army's most decorated officers. She's excited to work with you. As they discussed the practical details of Sarah's transition to military life, Principal Johnson appeared in the library doorway. Excuse me, he said hesitantly, but there are several news crews outside, and they're requesting interviews. The district superintendent is also here and would like to meet with everyone. Colonel Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. Sarah, this is entirely up to you, but this could be an opportunity to share your story in a way that might inspire other young people facing similar challenges. Would you be comfortable speaking to the media? Sarah looked around the table at these impressive military officers who had shown her such unexpected honor and respect. Just a few hours earlier, she had been dreading another day of high school humiliation. Now she was being asked to share her story with the world. The irony was not lost on her that her tormentors would now have to watch as she was celebrated for the very qualities they had mocked. "I think I'd like to do that," Sarah said, her voice stronger than she had ever heard it. "If my story can help other kids who are going through what I went through, then it's worth it." The impromptu press conference took place in the school's main auditorium, which had been hastily arranged to accommodate the growing media presence. As Sarah walked onto the stage with the military officers, she could see her classmates filing into the seats normally reserved for assemblies and graduation ceremonies. Madison and her friends sat in the front row, their expressions a mixture of fascination and bewilderment. The questions from the reporters were respectful but probing. They wanted to understand how a girl from such humble circumstances had attracted the attention of senior military leadership. Sarah found herself speaking with a confidence she didn't know she possessed, describing her journey from bullied outcast to future military officer. "The kids at school, they thought being poor meant I wasn't worth anything," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. "But my parents taught me that your circumstances don't define your character. How you respond to challenges, how you treat other people, how hard you're willing to work, that's what really matters." One reporter asked about the bullying she had endured, and Sarah paused before answering. She could see Madison shifting uncomfortably in her seat, probably wondering if Sarah would name names or describe specific incidents. "I won't pretend it was easy," Sarah said finally. "There were days when I didn't want to come to school, when I thought maybe they were right about me. But I had teachers like Mrs. Henderson here who believed in me, and parents who never let me give up on myself. The military taught me that adversity can either break you or make you stronger. I chose to let it make me stronger." Colonel Mitchell stepped to the podium next, and his words would be quoted in newspapers across the country for weeks afterward. "What we saw in Sarah Martinez's application wasn't just academic achievement, though that was impressive. We saw someone who had been tested by life and had emerged with her integrity intact. We saw leadership potential that had been forged in the furnace of real-world challenges. That's the kind of person we want leading our soldiers." As the press conference concluded, Sarah noticed that many of her classmates were looking at her with expressions she had never seen before. There was respect in their eyes, and something that might have been admiration. Students who had participated in her humiliation now seemed to be seeing her for the first time as a real person rather than a convenient target. But it was what happened after the reporters left that would stay with Sarah forever. As the auditorium emptied and the military officers prepared to depart, Madison Pierce approached Sarah hesitantly. Her usual entourage was nowhere to be seen, and, for the first time in 4 years, she seemed genuinely uncertain. "Sarah," Madison said quietly, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge, "I wanted to say something before you leave for West Point." Sarah waited, unsure what to expect from this unprecedented interaction. In all their years at school together, Madison had never spoken to her except to deliver an insult or orchestrate some new form of humiliation. "I owe you an apology," Madison continued, the words seeming to cause her physical pain. "The way I treated you, the way we all treated you, it was wrong. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say it." Sarah studied Madison's face, looking for signs of insincerity or some elaborate setup for a final cruel joke. But what she saw instead was something she had never associated with Madison Pierce: genuine remorse and, perhaps even shame. "I spent 4 years trying to make you feel small because I thought it made me feel bigger," Madison said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "But, watching all of this today, seeing what you've accomplished despite everything we put you through, I realized that you were always the stronger person. I was just too stupid and insecure to see it." The moment stretched between them, 4 years of pain and resentment hanging in the air. Sarah could have responded with anger, could have used this opportunity to finally give Madison a taste of her own medicine. Instead, she surprised herself with her response. "Madison, I forgive you," Sarah said simply. "But, more importantly, I hope you can learn from this and treat people better in the future. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their circumstances." Madison nodded, unable to speak through her tears, and walked away. It was the last conversation they would ever have, but it marked the beginning of changes at Lincoln High School that would outlast both of their graduations. As Sarah prepared to leave the school that afternoon, she was approached by dozens of underclassmen who had witnessed the day's events. Many of them were kids who had also been targets of bullying, students from poor families or those who didn't fit into the school's social hierarchy. They wanted to shake her hand, to tell her that her story had given them hope. "You showed us that where we come from doesn't have to determine where we go," said Maria Rodriguez, a sophomore whose family had immigrated from Mexico when she was young. "Thank you for proving that people like us can do extraordinary things." The local news coverage of Sarah's story spread far beyond their small town. Within days, she was receiving letters and emails from students across the country who had faced similar challenges. Teachers began using her story as an example of resilience and character. The video of her press conference went viral on social media, inspiring countless young people to pursue their dreams despite difficult circumstances. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the press conference, Sarah received a handwritten letter from General Patricia Williams, one of the highest-ranking women in the United States Army. The general had grown up in poverty in rural Alabama and had faced her own share of discrimination and doubt on her path to military leadership. "Dear Sarah," the letter read, "your story reminds me why I chose to serve. The military has always been a place where character matters more than connections, where merit trumps money, and where young people from all backgrounds can rise to the highest levels of leadership. You represent the best of what America can produce, and I look forward to seeing what you accomplish in the years ahead." The summer before Sarah left for West Point's preparatory program, she worked at her family's dry cleaning business, helping her parents manage the increased workload that came with the busy season. The work was hard and the hours long, but Sarah found herself appreciating this final opportunity to contribute to her family's livelihood before beginning her military career. Customers who had barely acknowledged her existence before now treated her with newfound respect. Word of her West Point acceptance and the dramatic visit from military officials had spread throughout their small community, and Sarah had become something of a local celebrity. More importantly, her story had begun to change the culture at Lincoln High School. The administration had implemented new anti-bullying policies, and teachers had received training on recognizing and addressing harassment. Madison Pierce, who would be attending a local community college in the fall, had volunteered to speak to incoming freshmen about the importance of treating all students with respect. On Sarah's last day of work at the family business, her parents closed the shop early and took her out to dinner at the nicest restaurant in town. It was a simple celebration, but it meant everything to Sarah to see the pride and joy in her parents' faces. "Mija," her father said, raising his glass of soda in a toast, "when you were born, I dreamed that you would have opportunities that your mother and I never had. But I never imagined you would achieve something like this. You have made us so proud." Her mother, wiping tears from her eyes, added, "Remember always who you are and where you came from. The military will teach you many things, but never forget the values we taught you in this little apartment behind our shop. Kindness, hard work, and treating all people with dignity, these are the things that will make you a great leader." As Sarah prepared to leave for West Point, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. The girl who had once hidden in the library to escape her tormentors was now preparing to become an officer in the United States Army. The path had been difficult, marked by daily humiliations and constant doubt, but it had led her to discover strengths she never knew she possessed. On her final morning at home, Sarah stood in her small bedroom, packing the last of her belongings into a simple duffel bag. On her desk sat the acceptance letter from West Point, now framed and faded from being handled so many times. Next to it was a photograph from the day the Black Hawk helicopter had landed at her school, showing her surrounded by the military officers who had believed in her potential. But the item she treasured most was a letter she had written to herself freshman year, during one of her darkest moments. In it, she had made a promise to somehow make something meaningful of her life, despite all the obstacles in her path. As she read those words now, written in the shaky handwriting of a frightened 14-year-old, she marveled at how far she had come. The girl they had teased had indeed watched a Black Hawk land just for her, but, more importantly, she had learned that her worth was not determined by the opinions of others. She had discovered that character forged in adversity was more valuable than privilege handed down through generations. And she had proven that with determination, integrity, and the courage to dream beyond her circumstances, any young person could soar to heights previously unimaginable. As Sarah Martinez left for West Point that morning, she carried with her not only her own dreams but the hopes of countless young people who had been told they weren't good enough, smart enough, or worthy enough to achieve greatness. Her story would continue to inspire others long after she had graduated from the academy and begun her career as a military officer, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary leaders come from the most humble beginnings.